Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And I was, a little bit confused on which video to either do, or I was even at one point in time going to review a little article, to kind of talk about this conversation. But of course, the conversation that we're going to be talking about is Mr. Oleksandr Usyk. And where does Oleksandr Usyk, after his tremendous and dominant victory over that of Dana Dubois in the rematch, which is pretty much what I had expected, but I will state that I was a little bit surprised that it had ended within the first 5 rounds. I thought that Dana Dubois was going to be able to last a little bit longer than that. But Oleksandr Usyk, of course, his great boxing IQ and skill set and technique, of course, once again was able to show through his very keen and sharp boxing mind. But there's no doubt about it, in my personal view, if you were to ask me the question, is Oleksandr Usyk an all-time great level fighter? No doubt about it. And I've already stated this. If you consider certain fighters, such as Terrence Bud Crawford or Joe Calzaghe or Bernard Hopkins or Andre Ward or, certain guys like that, Canelo Alvarez, if you consider those guys as all-time great level fighters, which I personally do, Oleksandr Usyk is at least on that level, if not even possibly over them. And there are certain people that, of course, would even debate, is Oleksandr Usyk debatably a top 10 fighter of all time? Is he someone that deserves to be in that realm? Well, I would kind of have to go through the fighters that I have on my list, but what I will personally state is this. If you were to put Oleksandr Usyk within the top 10 or the top 20 greatest fighters of all time, I would certainly understand it. I don't have any problem with that whatsoever. He's someone that not only has a great resume for both weight classes, but he's someone that is a 3 times undisputed champion, 2 times in the heavyweight class, once in the cruiserweight class, and he also did something that he was never supposed to do, which is beat some of the greater heavyweights of his era that at times were 20 plus pounds bigger than him. Now, of course, what the narrative would be by a lot of people is that, well, Usyk was in a quote-unquote weak era. Do I agree with that? No, I don't. But HatmanStrikesBack here, who is a channel that I would recommend to everybody, not stating that I agree with everything the man says, but there's a lot of things that he says that, in my view, that other people don't bring up. And I think that he has a great amount of three-dimensional thought, basically meaning what? That he doesn't just buy into narratives or what other people say. He doesn't go off of fight predictions off of a whim. He does things off of logical evidence, research, and things overall that seem, to be based in reality, which is very, very rare, not only in the boxing world, but really in the world in general, no matter what we're talking about. Because many people base their predictions, it doesn't matter what they're talking about, they base their predictions off of quote-unquote whims, or basically off of, basically, I feel, the direction is just changing this way. That's why Showbiz the Adult, for example, he predicted Dana Dubois to win, because he was going off of a whim. And when you go off of a whim, that's a great way to get your fight prediction wrong. You have to go off of how that style favors against the other style. You have to go against 20 other different factors as well. The age, how good is that fighter against this particular style? Do they tire out? What's their level of power? What's their level of speed? Do they have a skill set that maybe will not fare very well against this particular skill set? How did they look in their last fight? There's a multitude of things. Do they quit when the going gets tough? Other certain things like that. Do they wear down as the fight goes along? Can they not find another way to win if their main game plan is not working? Anyways, the point being is that HatmanStrikesBack, he's going to be talking about Oleksandr Usyk, and is he an all-time great top 10 heavyweight? And there's no doubt about it that Usyk is not just a great all-time great fighter, he's also a great heavyweight, no doubt about it. But the question is where does he exactly deserve to be on this list? Is he someone that is a top 5 heavyweight of all time? Is he someone that is a top 10 heavyweight of all time? Or does he not even deserve to be in the top 10 heavyweights of all time? Well, there's no doubt about it that Usyk, in my view, that he's an all-time great level fighter. And I had certain people, ask me, to review the Showbiz the Adult video, but I actually thought that I would review this video. Because HatmanStrikesBack, in my view, although Showbiz is a great personality, Hatman not only is a very great personality, but he's someone that is a much, much better boxing analyst than that of a Showbiz the Adult. And I know that certain people, they may be offended by that, but it just is what it is. It's no offense against Showbiz the Adult. Great person, great personality, a breath of fresh air, I think, to many boxing conversations. But in terms of his analytical or breakdown skills, he's not someone that's an elite level breakdown artist. He's just not, and most people are not when it comes to the boxing world. But anyways, that being stated, Hatman Strikes Back is going to be talking about it. But of course, the conversation about Oleksandr Usyk and if he's in the heavyweight GOAT conversation is a little bit tough. I don't know if I would claim that Usyk is the quote-unquote heavyweight greatest of all time, because although he does have one hell of a resume for being there, he has been there for a very, very short amount of time. Now, if you're talking about comparing him to fighters that have a great amount of title defenses that really didn't face a whole lot of great competition in my personal view, like Mike Tyson in my personal view, or Vladimir Klitschko in his era, or if you talk about maybe somebody else, yeah, maybe you could place him above some of those guys. But, with certain guys like Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, even then Evander Holyfield, it is going to be a little bit tougher because not only overall did those guys have a great amount of names, or not only did they have some quality, they had a certain amount of quantity within the quality. Now, I always usually pick quality over quantity every time, but when you have someone that has the combined quantity and quality, it gets a little bit tougher to rank. And the fact does remain that Usyk is someone that only has about 8 fights there. So I mean, it is a little bit tougher. But anyways, that being stated, there's no doubt about it that Usyk, that he does have to be at the very least considered a top 10 greatest heavyweight of all time, especially with the names that he has defeated, with the 3 A-grade level fighters that he has beat, 2 of the greater heavyweight fighters ever, in Tyson Fury and AJ Anthony Joshua, and on top of that, a 2 times undisputed champion, and someone, of course, that really should have never been able to beat those guys in the first place with their size advantage. But anyways, that being stated, let's get into the combo. Let's see what Hatman Strikes Back has to say. Let's tune in.
Welcome to Hatman Strikes Back Daily Boxing News. So following his sensational repeat victory over Daniel Dubois.
And keep in mind that I'm probably going to be doing a lot of talking within this video, so I apologize in advance. But this is going to be a very, very lengthy video, more than likely.
On the weekend, many people are now asking the question, is Oleksandr Usyk not only one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, but perhaps even the greatest heavyweight of all time? Has he surpassed the likes of Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, and so on? Well, the short answer is, in terms of heavyweight resume, absolutely not. And the way I judge a fighter's greatness is primarily based upon their resume. The reason I do that,
agreed, sir,
rather than base it on who I think would win in a fantasy matchup between, let's say, Usyk and Lennox Lewis, or Usyk and Mike Tyson, or Usyk and George Foreman, or Larry Holmes, etc., is because fantasy matchups are too subjective, whereas resume is something more tangible. Resume is a body of work that we can look to and compare to other fighters. We can look at their records and who they beat. So again,
agreed. And this is why I always state that if someone comes at me with a quote-unquote hypothetical argument, I usually don't even pay attention to it. And the reason why I don't pay attention to hypothetical arguments is because, especially if those 2 athletes were a part of the same era, and you're trying to debate to me that this guy is a quote-unquote greater fighter, but you bring up a hypothetical situation, like when the Terrence Bud Crawford fans try to state, well, if they were in the same weight class, he would end up beating this guy. That's great, but how can you prove that? The point is what we can prove is the quote-unquote resume, which is why for such a long time that Terrence Bud Crawford was not my #1 pound-for-pound fighter. Because I don't care how skilled you look in the ring. You can look like Floyd Mayweather. You could look like Roberto Duran. You could look like anyone that you want to look like in the ring. But until you face A-grade level competition, or you finally win the big one, or finally have something that is very impactful in your career, how do we know how actually great you really are? Take a look even at other sports. People love to proclaim that people are the new best thing very early. If you guys remember NBA basketball throughout my era, you would remember Anthony Davis with the New Orleans Pelicans. Or I should say New Orleans, because of course I have a couple friends down there and they would skin me alive if they heard me say the first pronunciation. But the point is that when Anthony Davis was with the Pelicans down there, down in the South, he basically was expected to be the next big thing. But really, after a while, it was very apparently clear that he was not going to have the same value as what certain people thought that he was going to. Now, skill and talent-wise, he was able to compete with anyone in the world, basically, no matter what. He had a great jump shot. He was someone that was pretty good in the post. He was someone that was a very decent athlete. He was a great three-point shooter for his size. He also was someone that was excellent defensively. And people kept saying that Anthony Davis is the next MVP winner. He's someone that's the next best player in the world. And what ended up happening? He could never overall basically bring them anywhere until he went off that team and, of course, went with LeBron James and the LA Lakers. He was never able to do anything by himself, and eventually he was surpassed by that of Giannis Antetokounmpo and Nikola Jokic, and possibly even a Joel Embiid. Take a look at NFL. You know, people always were stating that Aaron Rodgers is the greatest quarterback that I've ever seen. If he had more of a help and all sort of stuff, and then what ended up happening with Aaron Rodgers? He never even made a second Super Bowl appearance, and there was multiple opportunities that he had in order to get past certain teams, and he could never do it. And it wasn't even just championship level teams like the Seattle Seahawks or the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but also the Colin Kaepernick 49ers or the Jimmy Garoppolo-led 49ers or other certain teams like that. So the point is, what I'm saying is that you can appear to be as talented and as great as what you want, but until you face those A-grade level fighters or until you win that championship, it don't mean shit. And I know that a certain amount of people may not agree with that, but it is what it is. You know, to talk about boxing standards, take a look at Mike Tyson. He was supposed to be the greatest heavyweight fighter of all time. But then when he finally got in the ring with guys that had all-time great level talent, he never beat those guys. And on top of that, he usually would get his ass whooped and stopped. So, I mean, it is what it is. Adrian Broner, supposed to be the next Floyd Mayweather. What happened every time he got in the ring with an 8-grade level fighter? He got dominated. So the point is that although Crawford, of course, in my view, is greater, definitely greater than one of Mike Tyson or an Adrian Broner ever were, you know, and I would probably say Tyson is greater than Adrian Broner, of course. But I mean, the point is that you never know until they're in the ring with an A-grade level fighter. So that's why, although people kept trying to push this narrative that, you know, Crawford isn't ranked #1 because he's a black fighter and they're just trying to keep a black fighter down. No, the reason why he wasn't ranked #1 pound for pound is because Canelo and Lomachenko at one time had a greater resume. It just is what it is. And to be quite honest with you, Canelo still has a way greater resume than Terrence Bud Crawford. And people can like that, they cannot like that. But it is what it is, you know, anyway. And let me also state this, you know, once again, not to interrupt too much, but it's also why I don't have Naoya Inoue quite yet at #1 on my resume. Now, if he beats a couple of other A-grade level names, because right now I think he only has about confirmed 2 A-grade level names, at least in my view, I would include Marlon Tapales and Steve Von Fulton. But of course, if he got a win over Junto Nakatani and Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, for example, let's just say he got those 2 wins, he'd be the for sure #1 pound for pound fighter in my view, at least debatably. You know, if Oleksandr Usyk maybe were to retire, maybe. But I mean, even then, you could debate that Inoue could still be #1, even over Usyk if he was able to beat those 2 guys. You know, but of course, it's a bit harder because Usyk was able to defeat a pound for pound guy, in my view, in Tyson Fury, and maybe even debatably in AJ, and those guys were a decent amount bigger than him. So, I mean, it is what it is. But in a way, the fighters that I want to see him fight that would put him higher on the list, in my view, and he's already top 3 pound for pound, in my view. But the fighters that I want to see him fight that are the big A-grade level threats, Nick Ball, Bruce Shushu Carrington, you know, that one guy, MJ Akhmadaliev, of course, who's probably about A-, not A+ or anything, but A-, you know. But the fights that I want to see, especially Junto Nakatani, Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez, Nick Ball, and Bruce Shushu Carrington, those are the fights that I want to see.
Aaron Usyk's heavyweight resume to some of the other greats, which we're going to look at in a second, it doesn't stack up next to theirs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he couldn't beat those guys. I personally think, and I've said this in previous videos, that Oleksandr Usyk's style and his skills would be all wrong for Muhammad Ali. But that's just an opinion. We don't have a time.
Agreed. And I agree with everything that he just stated there. We can never prove that because, we don't have a time machine. We're never going to know. But do I also agree that Oleksandr Usyk, at least if you were to just take a look at their skills on the surface, and basically just, basically accumulate whatever they could do for their generation, do I believe that Usyk would probably beat Muhammad Ali and actually probably beat him dominantly if you were to transfer Ali from the 60s all the way today? Yes, I do. Now, that being stated, the question really should be, is not if Usyk would have beat Ali from the 60s, but the question would be, is that what if Muhammad Ali was a part of the same generation as Oleksandr Usyk and he was able to be the benefit of some of the improved formulas or techniques or certain things that they probably not only took from the older generations, but also had improved upon? Because, of course, every generation usually takes a little bit from the past and they end up improving on it a little bit. At least that's what that's what really they're supposed to do. So it's a little bit tough for me to just compare because everyone is a product of their generation. But that being stated, you have a lot of people, and I've seen it in my comment section as well, to where people state, oh, this is a weak era. If you were to place, guys like Holyfield and Ali or whatever, in the generation today, they overall would destroy everybody. Actually, no, that's not the case. Especially if you were to take them from the 1960s. Ali was not someone overall that was just completely flawless in terms of technique or skill wise. Now, he was someone that was an all-time great level fighter, tremendously skilled. But when you talk about in terms of his defensive prowess, he was not someone that was as much of a defensive master as what some people overall really try to state that he was. And I'm not claiming that he didn't have great defensive ability at times, but Ali's defensive ability is really more like a Roy Jones Jr. than what it is in the class of a Mayweather or a Usyk or a Canelo or a Pernell Sweet Whitaker. You know, he's not someone that keeps his hands up extraordinarily well. That's why he would always get caught by a left hook, because he would oftentimes keep his right hand down, you know, which is why he got knocked down against Henry Cooper and Joe Frazier and a multitude of other fighters, I believe, with that of the left hook, and suffered 1 or 2 broken jaws in his career when it came down to it. And then on top of that, he was someone that did not avoid a great lead hand quite as well. Take a look at the Kenny Norton fights, although of course he wasn't quite as athletic in those fights as what he had used to be, but still it is what it is. Usyk probably isn't quite as athletic as what he used to be either, and he's someone overall that still is quite defensively sound. Ali also was someone that was not a great body puncher. He did go to the body here and there, but he wasn't someone that was an excellent body puncher like that of an Oleksandr Usyk at certain times. So if you just ask me, off of the evidence that I've seen over Kenny Norton and Joe Frazier and certain things like that, do I believe that Ali, if you just transport him, you know, and, you know, put him in this time against Oleksandr Usyk, do I believe that the same Ali from the 1960s beats Usyk? No, I don't. But like I said, the question is that, you know, Ali, if he was somehow able to somewhat keep that style or some of his best qualities, as well as improve on things and kind of be a part of this generation, could he beat Oleksandr Usyk? You know, possible. I don't know. That's a question we're never going to know. But I mean, you know, and of course we wouldn't know the other one either. But the point is that, you know, everyone is a product of their generation, you know, which is why you kind of have to give respect to those generations, even if they don't really look quite as skilled as the time. There are certain great fighters, you know, overall, even like a Joe Louis or a Rocky Marciano, you know, that I would both still consider, you know, great fighters, you know, even all-time great level fighters. But you take a look at them back then compared to today, they're going to look like shit. You know, it just is what it is. But anyways.
Machine to send Usyk back to the 1960s to fight a Prime Ali. So we'll never know, obviously. But if we're to look at his resume at heavyweight, you can see on screen here, he beat Chaz Witherspoon, who was a late replacement, Derek Chisora, when Chisora was still somewhat useful, Anthony Joshua twice, Daniel Dubois twice, Tyson Fury twice. He's had 8 heavyweight fights, but he's only fought 5 different opponents. And of course, 6 of those fights have been World Heavyweight Championship fights. If we compare that to some of the other revered heavyweight champions throughout history, look at Rocky Marciano. He's the only heavyweight champion to retire undefeated. Oleksandr Usyk, if he retired right now, would be the second man in history to do that. For me,
Rocky Marciano, in my view, has slowly become a little bit more underrated over the years. And I know that a lot of people are not going to agree with me on that. Now, am I claiming that the fighters that Rocky Marciano fought, that they were always the most skilled within history? No. Am I claiming that he didn't have a certain amount of bums on his resume? No, that's not what I'm claiming. But what I am stating is that when Rocky Marciano, when he did fight guys like Ezra Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott and Archie Moore and a couple of other contenders, Rocky Marciano overall showed up, and he showed up in big form. Now, was he a guy that was the most technically sound fighter even for the era? No. But he was someone that was a phenomenal fighter, and he was actually starting to get technically better, I believe, as time went along. But we're going to talk about Rocky Marciano a little bit later, because Marciano was a phenomenally great fighter. He wasn't someone that had as long as a list or resume as some others within the history. But that being stated, would I put his career above that of, say, Joe Louis's? Yes, I would. And I know that a certain amount of people overall that they're not going to agree with that, but I'm going to explain why as the video goes along.
Not only would I pick Oleksandr Usyk to beat Rocky Marciano easily in a fantasy matchup, but I think that Usyk's resume is better than Marciano's resume as well. So Marciano didn't have...
You could debate that, but the problem is, once again, is that everyone's generation is a bit different. But what I'm also going to claim is this. If you want to claim that Marciano's resume is worse than Oleksandr Usyk's, you'd also have to claim the same thing, in my view, as a Joe Louis. Now, Joe Louis, of course, has a bunch of these title defenses, but if you take a look at a lot of those fighters that he fought, you wouldn't even be able to pick him out.
Have a long reign at the top.
Not stating, of course, that that's the case with every fighter that he fought. He did fight, I believe, about 7, somewhat of quality fighters during his era, although maybe some were maybe a little bit behind it, or maybe not as talented. I mean, you know, it is what it is. He did beat Primo Carnera, I believe, that one big Italian heavyweight, someone that wasn't really the most talented heavyweight of all time, but because he was so big and powerful, you know, he was someone, of course, that could get by. So, I mean, if you want to count that, I believe that he also beat Max Schmeling, not someone that I would consider maybe an all-time great heavyweight, but someone that, of course, beat Joe Louis in that first fight, and Joe Louis got revenge, and someone that got a couple of other decent wins. So, I mean, that's up to you. Of course, he also beat J. James Braddock, I believe, and Jack Sharkey, and, you know, of course, Jersey Joe Walcott, and, you know, I think there was another fighter on there as well. But the reason why I place Rocky Marciano's career above Joe Louis, the reason why that is because Joe Louis was kind of a part of a generation where he was kind of protected against certain black fighters or other fighters of color. Now, he did once again fight certain great Caucasoid fighters, don't get it twisted. There was still a certain amount of great Caucasoid fighters for that day. Max Baer, you know, Primo Carnera, you know, Jack Sharkey, James J. Braddock, if you want to count those guys. But the thing is that Joe Louis not only was a legit level heavyweight, someone that was around 215, 220 pounds, I believe, and with like a 76-inch arm reach and about 6 foot. But on top of that, he was a guy that when he finally fought those elite black fighters, and Ezra Charles, and also that of a Jersey Joe Walcott, he lost to Ezra Charles, although of course that was after a 2-year layoff. That does have to be mentioned. But on top of that, he also got one of the worst robberies of all time against Jersey Joe Walcott in that first fight. So the point being is that Joe Louis, although he was a great fighter, don't get it twisted, when you talk about Rocky Marciano in comparison, certain people, of course, will debate that those guys were older. They were older, but they were still great at great points in their career. Jersey Joe Walcott, overall, the thing is about Rocky Marciano is that you can never debate that he had a controversial decision over anybody or that he ever lost to anybody, because it never usually got to the final bell. And if it did, Rocky Marciano still won off a decision. So that's why Rocky Marciano, in my view, would be greater, because what I hold in higher quality is if you were able to beat the best of your era, and Joe Louis was not always able to do that. And not only did he lose to Ezra Charles and probably should have lost to Jersey Joe Walcott the first time around, he also lost to Max Schmeling. But anyway.
The world title from Jersey Joe Walcott, rematched Walcott, fought Ron Lastaza, Ezra Charles twice, Don Cockle, and Archie Moore. So there's a couple of rematches in there. And as I say, not an enormous number of heavyweight title fights. And he was around.
Now, some people, of course, may retort and they say, well, you place Canelo Alvarez's resume above that of a Terrence Bud Crawford's, but he's already lost twice. And that would be a point overall to bring up. But here's the thing. Canelo Alvarez has beaten fighters, in my view, that debatably are greater than the best win on Crawford's resume. That's the problem. When you talk about Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano, they were a part of the same weight class. You know, so I mean, it's much easier to compare that way. But when you talk about Crawford and Canelo, it's a little bit harder to compare because they're not a part of the same weight class. So we kind of have to judge off of what we see and what we think and what we know off of the class of that fighter. But the thing is that the two losses overall that Canelo Alvarez suffered in his career, I don't think Crawford has ever fought someone on the same class anywhere near of a Mayweather. And I don't think that Errol Spence, in my view, was quite on the same class as a Bivol, although some would disagree. But anyway. And of course, not to mention, Canelo was just obviously too small for that weight class. So it's not something that I can completely count and say that Canelo just completely lost because of a skill v skill match. It was a part of it, but he also lost because of size as well.
Weak era. So wherever you want to place Rocky Marciano on the all-time great heavyweight champions list, and bear in mind he was tiny by today's standards, Marciano wouldn't even be a cruiserweight. He'd be a light heavyweight. Remember?
Absolutely. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. People don't understand how phenomenal Rocky Marciano actually was. This guy was 5'10.5" at most with a 68-inch arm reach. Imagine being a heavyweight fighter, sometimes fighting guys like Ezra Charles or Jersey Joe Walcott or Joe Louis with a 73-plus inch reach. And if you take a look at his fights against, you know, not just Joe Louis, although Joe Louis was a bit past it by the time that Rocky Marciano had fought him, but Ezra Charles and, Jersey Joe Walcott and Archie Moore, they still were basically at peak or very prime versions of their career. And I know that a lot of people are not going to agree because they were older. But the thing is that when you talk about Ezra Charles, he was actually 33 years old. So that was not an excuse. And when you talk about Jersey Joe Walcott, he was someone that was 38 years old, but he was someone that the prior year at 37 had just beat Ezra Charles for the first time in his career, I believe, in the trilogy and then the fourth match, and beat him 2 times in a row. So that was when Jersey Joe Walcott was probably looked at as debatably being in the best point in his career because he was finally able to get those victories over Ezra Charles. And of course, when he fought Archie Moore, he fought him at, I believe, about 40, 41 years old, which of course is pretty decently aged. But the thing is that Archie Moore was still clearly the best light heavyweight in the world. He had defended the light heavyweight titles a multitude of times. And then he moved up to the weight class and fought Rocky. And Archie Moore and Rocky, by the way, were the same size. Because although people will say that Rocky was a heavyweight for that generation, actually, he really wasn't. He was someone that wasn't even the same size as a Joe Louis or a Jersey Joe Walcott. Those were like real heavyweights of the day. Rocky Marciano could have easily competed at the light heavyweight class. He could have easily competed there. So, I mean, it is what it is. He was a fighter that, once again, would rehydrate at about 185 at maximum. And then on top of that, he only had about a 68-inch reach and was about 5'10.5". People don't understand how phenomenal of a machine and a fighter that you have to be, by being undefeated and beating some of the guys that he did, even if they were a bit older, but still at great points in their career. Now, once again, Archie Moore, I have to mention him. Keep in mind that a lot of people count Muhammad Ali's win over Archie Moore as one of the great wins of his career. But when he fought Archie Moore, first of all, not only was he way bigger than Archie Moore, because Ali at that time would have been a quote-unquote super heavyweight, but the bigger heavyweights pretty much came in after Liston beat Floyd Patterson. Because the undersized heavyweights pretty much ended one Sonny Liston, who was about 220, 6'1" with an 84-inch reach. He was just a bear of a man. He was someone overall that pretty much ended that smaller heavyweight era. Once Floyd Patterson got knocked out, that's pretty much when that era ended. But Rocky Marciano, man, I keep telling people this. People don't know how good and how great he actually was.
Back when Marciano was fighting, they were weighing in on the day of the fight.
And keep in mind that a lot of people count that Ali's win was a great win over Archie Moore. However, Archie Moore was even older when he fought Ali. And on top of that, he was no longer even the light heavyweight champion of the world. At least when Rocky Marciano beat Archie Moore, he was still one of the top pound-for-pound fighters and the clear best light heavyweight in the world, and then defended his titles, I believe, before that fight and after that fight.
So he was weighing in, for example, when he fought Ron Lastaza, 185 pounds. That means if he
absolutely
was around today, he'd be making 175, no problem. You see what I'm saying? And yeah, for me, the resume of Rocky Marciano, not as good as Oleksandr Usyk's resume. I think Usyk has beat...
You could debate that, but like I stated, everyone is a product of their generation. But in my personal view, like I stated, if you're going to debate this with Rocky Marciano, you would also have to debate this with Joe Louis.
More difficult fighters in his short heavyweight reign of, as I say, just 6 fights.
But of course, that begs the question, do you want someone that, has 20 title defenses, but a lot of those title defenses probably aren't looked at as all-time great level fighters? Or, with some of them maybe being all-time great level fighters, like, Jersey Joe Walcott, at least for the era, or certain other guys like that, Or do you want more quality over quantity, someone that doesn't have anywhere near the title defenses or the number of fights there, but their quality is probably higher? So that's the question about Oleksandr Usyk. To me, I pick quality over quantity any day, which is why I've put Rocky Marciano over Joe Louis. Because Joe Louis, when he finally fought those elite level black fighters, and Rocky Marciano still fought them at a great point in their career, if not the peak of their career, Joe Louis ended up losing to a couple of those guys and should have lost that first fight against Jersey Joe Walcott in one of the worst robberies ever. But anyway.
Then we can have a look at Joe Louis. Now, I would argue that Joe Louis was around in a relatively weak heavyweight era as well. However, he had such a long reign. The longevity that he had goes some way to proving his greatness. Because in heavyweight boxing, even somebody who is no great shakes, if they have a good day and you as the champion have a really bad day, you can get hit and hurt and stopped or otherwise beaten. So we have to factor in the consistency, the longevity of Joe Louis. Despite the fact he didn't have that many amazing heavyweights around to fight during his day, he still holds the record of most title defenses. Last night.
Right, and that's great, but it's like, that's like holding a record overall at the very beginning of a sport, or basically in an era to where it basically doesn't matter. I mean, that's almost kind of like Bill Russell's 11 championships. And don't get it twisted. Bill Russell overall is someone that deserves a lot of credit. He's one of the greatest basketball players and one of the greatest athletes in my personal view of all time. But you can't compare his 11 championships and say, oh, he has, overall several more championships than some of these other players. Because around that time, it was just way different. They had only 8 NBA teams, and they didn't really have free agency. So it was just something that was completely different.
checked. I don't think Vladimir Klitschko broke it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he did.
No, Vladimir Klitschko, I believe, had about 18 title defenses of his IBF title. And when we talk about the weakest eras of the heavyweight era, I'm not going to necessarily put Joe Louis or, Rocky Marciano's era as much up there. But that being stated, Joe Louis was a little bit protected. And that being stated, he was not the only black fighter of that era that was a little bit protected. And don't get it twisted. There was Caucasoid fighters, of course, that were protected. That's why I don't put Jack Dempsey within my all-time great conversations, at least within the top 10, because he was a part of an era to where those fighters weren't even allowed to face fighters of color. So, I can't put him necessarily in that conversation. Same reason why I don't claim that Babe Ruth is for sure the greatest baseball player of all time, because he was a part of a generation where it basically was mainly a Caucasoid league and only a part of America. Or the Negro leagues, of course, where they only had, black players. So it's hard to judge off of that.
Joe Louis still has the record. So in terms of resume, I wouldn't put Oleksandr Usyk above Joe Louis in the all-time great list. I think, again,
Well, I've already stated this once again. If you're talking about quote-unquote resume, once again, a lot of those title defenses, if you maybe want to claim, his resume is better, I would understand, because it's not like, once again, that Joe Louis didn't beat any great fighters. I guess we could count James J. Braddock and, Jack Sharkey. I don't really know if you would consider him as all-time great, but he was someone that was decent. Max Schmeling, I suppose. I don't think I would consider him all-time great, but he was someone that was very decent. Was the heavyweight champion at one point in time. Of course, beat Joe Louis. But, of course, the biggest wins of his career would be probably Jersey Joe Walcott and, a few others, James J. Braddock, certain guys like that, Max Baer. It's kind of up to you. But the point is that, once again, there's a reason why I put Rocky Marciano above Joe Louis. Rocky Marciano, when he fought some of the greater black fighters of his day, he clearly won because he either knocked him out or he beat him by decision. Joe Louis didn't always do that.
Fantasy matchup, Usyk would beat Joe Louis. That's my personal opinion. But if we're going to look...
Well, I agree with that, but the problem is that it's a little bit hard to compare. And the reason why that is because they're just a part of completely different eras.
Look at something more tangible, which are boxing records, resumes. I still have to place Joe Louis above him in terms of achievements. Then we move on to Muhammad Ali. And by the way, Joe Louis had well over 20 heavyweight world title fights.
He did, but a lot of those guys were not really great of class. It just is what it is. So that's why Joe Louis, in my view, although I do think he is a great fighter, he's someone that, in my view, is a little bit overrated.
Muhammad Ali also had well over 20 heavyweight world title fights. He beat numerous champions, numerous great fighters. If we start off way early on in his career, he beat Archie Moore, who actually used to be his trainer, just a few fights prior to taking Archie Moore on. How weird is that? Archie Moore, of course, was a world champion, one of the great...
Once again, as I've already stated, you can't count the Archie Moore win as a quote-unquote great win for Muhammad Ali and not count it as a great win for Rocky Marciano. When, first of all, Rocky Marciano was probably just as big as Archie Moore, first of all, and then on top of that, Archie Moore was still the light heavyweight champion of the world and defended it before and then after he fought Rocky Marciano. With Muhammad Ali, he was no longer a title contender, or he was no longer the champion there.
Light heavyweight world champions in history. He beat Sonny Liston twice when Liston was a beast. So that's a second champion. Floyd Patterson, of course, former world champion. A string of dangerous contenders. Cleveland Williams wasn't at his best after suffering a gunshot wound at the hands of the police. But he was still formidable when he fought Ali. Ali dusted him off. He obviously had his issues with the American government, which meant that he couldn't box for a couple of years. He came back.
Well, when we talk about Muhammad Ali, once again, one of the greatest resumes, debatably the greatest resume for a heavyweight fighter. Now, just to compare Rocky Marciano and Usyk, and of course Joe Louis and Usyk, would I consider Usyk above both of those fighters on the all-time great list? I would definitely consider him over Joe Louis. Rocky Marciano, it's a little bit tougher, but I probably would consider him over him, at least if you place him within that top 20 or top 10 range, because Rocky Marciano is someone that, he just didn't quite have as long of a tenure, and of course, even for the day, he wasn't someone that you would claim would be a quote-unquote technically, just flawless fighter. He was someone that had a certain amount of flaws, but also keep in mind, Rocky Marciano, I believe, started very, very late in his career. I believe that he started boxing at around like 25, 26 years old. He wasn't the only fighter, I believe, that would do that, probably of that era, but the fact that he ended up as great as what he was and as dominant as what he was, and he started off that late, it was pretty phenomenal. But would I probably put Usyk above both those fighters? Probably. probably. But I mean, it's kind of a debate because that era back then was just, it was a little bit different.
Frazier lost that fight, obviously. Beat Jimmy Ellis, a former sparring partner of his and also a former heavyweight champion. Beat Floyd Patterson again. Beat Bob Foster, a great light heavyweight champion. Beat Ken Norton, who would go on to become heavyweight champion. Beat Joe Frazier.
Absolutely. When we talk about Muhammad Ali and probably the biggest wins of his career, at least against fighters that were at decent points, of course, you're talking about Sonny Liston, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Kenny Norton, Ernie Shavers, and I'm sure that there's a certain amount of other fighters that I'm not even mentioning. Floyd Patterson, if you want to mention him, although Floyd Patterson, kind of like Rocky Marciano, he was someone that was probably heavily undersized for the heavyweight division by the time that guys like Ali and Liston had showed up. Like, Liston, I think, was about like 25 pounds bigger than Floyd. Like, it was, he was pretty fucking massive.
Frazier again beat George Foreman, which was a fantastic win. He was the world champion at the time. Beat Joe Frazier for the second time. Did I say beat Joe Frazier again? He fought Joe Frazier again the second time.
But that's actually a great comparison when certain people overall claim that Usyk is only winning in this generation because they're big and slow and all this other stuff. I mean, you can factor that in if you want to, but the thing is that the heavyweight division has always had certain guys that are very decently big overall for the weight class, and people overall that would be quote-unquote big and slow, at least compared to some of the smaller guys. Primo Carnera, someone that I wouldn't really claim was even technically great even for the day. But Sonny Liston was a big old bear. He was someone that wasn't always the most technically sound fighter. He had technique, but he was someone that wouldn't ever be looked at as, one of the top 10 most technical heavyweights of all time or anything. He was someone that, was 20 pounds bigger than some of the fighters that he fought, and someone that was just a big bear of a man. George Foreman was someone that, although he had technique, he was someone that, really just tried to bruise with you. I'm not stating once again that he didn't have boxing technique, but he was not someone that, was just super technically gifted in every area.
I'm obviously got revenge over him. And then
So my point being is that for anyone to claim that just anyone could have done what Usyk could have done in this era, especially against the likes of AJ Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury and even Danny Dubois, no, they couldn't have.
The trilogy with a second win over Joe Frazier. Beat Jimmy Young, who was a very tricky fighter. Beat Ken Norton again. Beat Leon Spinks in the rematch after losing to him in the first fight. So that's another win over a champion. But then, of course, lost to
Well, Leon Spinks was one of those guys that probably should have never been a champion in the first place. Now, of course, he was a gold medalist, I believe, in the Olympics, but Leon Spinks in his professional career, of course, was very underwhelming, which is why if you take a look at his career, I think he was like 23-17 or something like that, or, it's not a very good record. He got that win over Ali when he was 8-0, and Ali really should have not even been fighting at that point. His legs were basically done by that time. Pretty much after the Thriller in Manila, he was never the same really after that. He really should have not been fighting at that point, but, it is what it is.
Holmes lost to Trevor Berbick. So, Muhammad Ali, well over 20 world title fights, beat some all-time greats, reigning champions. The wins over Sonny Liston and George Foreman, of course, being the standout wins because of the fact that those two guys were terrorizing the heavyweight division during their respective eras.
Well, in my view, the Joe Frazier win is a greater win than the Sonny Liston win. Now, the reason why the Sonny Liston win is probably standing out more is because it was looked at as such an upset. But Sonny Liston was a guy that only had defended the titles once. Keep in mind, Joe Frazier defended the titles, I believe, a total of several times. Now, if you want to debate the level of competition, that's up to you. But in my view, Joe Frazier is certainly over a fighter like a Sonny Liston, skills-wise and also accomplishments-wise.
Ali came along against the odds, underdog both times, and turned him over. So Ali's resume is arguably the best resume in heavyweight history.
Yes, it is, which is why I would have to claim that Muhammad Ali is the greater heavyweight fighter. Now, in terms of who's the greater fighter all around, I mean, one can maybe claim that it's a little bit of a debate. Once again, I'm not exactly sure where I would rank Oleksandr Usyk within my all-time greats, but what I will personally state is this. If Usyk, let's just say within his next 4 fights or, within the next few fights, if he was able to defeat Joseph Parker, and then on top of that, Andrew Ruiz, and then maybe 1 or 2 other fighters that are super notable of that weight class, you could certainly possibly start to state that he could be getting in that top 5 heavyweight range. As of right now, I wouldn't put Oleksandr Usyk probably within my top 5 heavyweights of all time, or at least not definitively, but I would probably put him in my top 10.
Then we look at Larry Holmes. Now, Larry Holmes was around in my opinion, a weaker era.
I agree. Larry Holmes, in my personal view, once again, when you talk about some of the weaker eras within that of the heavyweight division, Probably, the middle of the Joe Louis era, probably the Larry Holmes era, the Mike Tyson era when he was unified champ, and also the Vladimir Klitschko era. Those are the real weak eras of the heavyweight division.
Of heavyweight boxing, this is during the late 70s, early 1980s. He obviously did beat the likes of Muhammad Ali when Ali was totally washed up. Ernie Shavers, Mike Weaver, Ken Norton, so on and so forth. Tim Witherspoon, who was green at the time, Marvis Frazier, David Bay, Carl Williams. He beat a lot of either past, present, or future world champions during his reign, Larry Holmes. And late on in his career, he went on to get a win over Ray Mercer, who was WBO heavyweight champion at one point. So Larry Holmes again.
I believe that Larry Holmes pretty much only got one great win after he ended up losing to Michael Spinks. And I think that was over that of a Chris Bird or whatever his name was, or whatever he just said, the one guy that knocked out Tommy Morrison, but other than that, he never really won anything big again, at least to my recollection, after he ended up losing to Michael Spinks and then Mike Tyson. And let me also state this because, people may state overall, because in my personal view, Larry Holmes was pretty much washed by the time that he had fought Tyson, or at least a fighter that was nowhere near peak form. And certain people may say, well, you said with Rocky Marciano or other fighters, or like when Joe Calzaghe beat Bernard Hopkins when they were in their 40s, that, they still were at a debatable prime or peak form in their career, right? But those guys were still either the unified champion of the world, or on top of that, we're not coming off losses, or on top of that, were guys that were beating pound for pound fighters. Like when Joe Calzaghe, for example, beat Bernard Hopkins, Hopkins was still beating other pound for pound guys, like Kelly Pavlik and Antonio Tarver, and also that of a Winky Wright. He just didn't beat Calzaghe. But also, when you talk about that of Archie Moore, he still was a pound for pound fighter, I believe, and still the light heavyweight champion. When Mike Tyson fought Larry Holmes overall had lost 2 fights in a row to Michael Spinks. He then took over 2 years off, and then he got in the ring at 40 years old against Mike Tyson. I'm sorry, but you're not going to sit here and tell me that was a great version of Larry Holmes.
Extensive reign as heavyweight.
But as I've always stated, just because a fighter is a little bit older doesn't always mean that of course, they, that they were always at a super weak point in their career. Take a look at Usyk right now. Take a look at Beterbiev, even at 40 years old. Take a look at Bernard Hopkins in his early 40s and late 30s. Take a look at Archie Moore, even in his early 40s. Not every fighter that is a little bit older is just completely washed up. Everyone ages differently.
Champion. Not in the strongest era, it has to be said, but still, he showed consistency over time. We can move on to Mike Tyson, who came right after Larry Holmes, right on his heels. He was fighting a lot of the, I want to say, Larry Holmes leftovers. So Mike Tyson was around in not a particularly strong era as well.
Agreed. And a lot of people, of course, would disagree. Now, Mike Tyson did defeat a lot of former champions or champions, such as Trevor Berbick or James Bone Crusher Smith or Henry Tillman, I believe, or Pinkelton Thomas. But those guys, in my personal view, and this is what I mean. When people claim overall that this is a weak era and that fighters from the 80s or 90s, that they would have just completely had them as food, bro, you're not going to sit here and tell me that guys like James Bone Crusher Smith and Frank, or what's his name? James Tillis, and Pinkelton Thomas and Frank Bruno, you're not going to fucking tell me that those guys are above guys like AJ Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury. To be honest with you, I wouldn't even put those guys above Joseph Parker. But anyway.
In his prime, but he fought whoever was there and he beat most of who was there.
He did, and Mike Tyson was an undisputed champion. I'll give him credit for that. But the thing is who the fuck were those guys? No offense, but none of those fighters that he beat would ever be considered an all-time great level heavyweight. Mike Tyson, other than a 40-year-old Larry Holmes, who was off for 2 years and suffering 2 losses, so I don't even consider that as a confirmed A-grade level win. And Larry Holmes never even won any title again after that. So, I mean, it is what it is. But point being is that, when you talk about it, Mike Tyson, whenever he fought a legit all-time great level talent, he pretty much lost. So this conversation overall about how Mike Tyson is so much greater than guys like Usyk or all this other shit. I mean, to be quite honest with you, it's really even a debate if Mike Tyson is even greater than someone like an AJ Anthony Joshua. And I know that a lot of people overall that or Tyson Fury even, and I know that that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. But at least those guys defeated some of the greatest fighters of their era. Like, who the fuck did Mike Tyson ever beat? I mean, he beat Razor Ruddock, he beat Henry Till, or Pinkelton Thomas, James Tillis, he beat overall Frank Bruno. But those guys, I'm sorry, those guys are not shit. It is what it is. Those guys are not elite level heavyweight fighters. And a lot of those guys had, do some research on them. A lot of those guys had some fucking drug problems, cocaine problems, alcoholism, meth heads. So this bullshit about how, these guys, they're not in anywhere near as good a shape as some of the fighters back then. Bro, take a look at James Buster Douglas and Buster Mathis. James Buster Douglas had one fight where he was in peak condition against that of a Mike Tyson, because I believe he promised his mother that he was going to win the fight. His mother was very, very close to him. And his father was a former boxer. He always, stated that he should start to eat healthier and get some discipline. He never could. And I believe overall that he became morbidly obese after the Mike Tyson fight. But he got in such great condition and took that fight seriously, because not only was he facing Mike Tyson, but his mother had just passed away. So he basically was someone that, overall was a one-hit wonder. He was someone that, overall had that one great performance. And then in the next fight against Evander Holyfield, his demons once again showed up. The man had a beer belly. He had man titties. The man was not an all-time great level fighter, but he was someone that was talented. He just couldn't ever really overall, show the discipline.
Youngest heavyweight champion in history, became undisputed very quickly, took on all comers. I think the first world champion he beat, or former world champion, was Alfonso Ratliff, who was, I think, former cruiserweight champion. And he beat Trevor Berbick, world champion.
Trevor Berbick is also another fighter that I would not consider someone overall that is a quote-unquote great fighter. Sorry, but it is what it is.
Bone Crusher Smith, world champion. Pinklon Thomas was a former world champion. Tony Tucker was an incumbent world champion. Larry Holmes was a former world champion. Tony Tubbs was a former world champion. Michael Spinks was a two-weight world champion.
Michael Spinks, to be quite honest with you, was probably the greatest fighter that Mike Tyson ever beat. And he never really even belonged to that heavyweight class in the first place.
Light heavyweight and heavyweight. Frank Bruno would go on to be world champion. Beat Carl Williams. And then over...
Frank Bruno overall, it's so funny to me. There's so many people that compare, AJ Anthony Joshua or Tyson Fury to Frank Bruno. Dude, Frank Bruno was like a 1 or 2 time champion, I believe. That dude overall, don't even get me started about that dude. That dude overall, whenever Mike Tyson, fought him, that dude was shaking in his fucking boots. Like, people always love to put Frank Bruno on this all-time great level. He wasn't an all-time great level fighter. To be quite honest with you, I don't even think he was an A-grade level fighter. It's just hilarious to me overall how certain people try to say that Frank Bruno was greater than any of the British champions today. Please stop. If Frank Bruno overall fought Tyson Fury and AJ Anthony Joshua, he get fucking knocked out within 5 or 6 rounds.
He lost to Buster Douglas. Later on in his career, he would beat Bruno again, who was an incumbent champion, beat Bruce Seldon, an incumbent champion, lost to Holyfield twice, of course, beat Francois Botha, who was a former world champion, beat Orlin Norris, who was a cruiserweight champion. You get where I'm going with this. Mike Tyson beat plenty of past, present, or would go on to be world champions. And I think he had 16 world title fights. So again, compare that to Usyk, who's had 6 world title fights against only 3 different guys. He isn't there yet as far as resume.
Well, this is my personal view of it. I know Mike Tyson has all those title defenses, but as I've already stated, it depends on who you beat for me and also the quality over the quantity. I can really give a shit that Mike Tyson has all those title defenses. I don't care how many bum-ass champions he ended up defeating in that conversation. Truth being told is that Mike Tyson never defeated anybody that was on the level of an AJ Anthony Joshua or a Tyson Fury. Really not even close. So, I mean, Usyk, in my personal view, not only is he for sure a greater fighter than someone like a Mike Tyson, I don't even think that's a conversation. But in my view, I may even put him at the heavyweight division above a Mike Tyson. And I know to a lot of people that that's going to be heavily controversial. But please, name me a fighter or a couple of fighters that Mike Tyson ever beat that were greater than Fury or greater than AJ Anthony Joshua. You can't name any.
Comparing him,
and once again, I'm not counting Larry Holmes.
to Mike Tyson. Similar thing for Evander Holyfield. Now, if you compare Usyk's cruiserweight resume to Holyfield's cruiserweight resume, in my opinion, Usyk's cruiserweight resume blows Holyfield's out of the water.
I agree. And Evander Holyfield is someone that beat a couple of decent fighters, I believe. I believe that he beat De Leon, and I believe he also beat Muhammad Quaid. But that being stated, Usyk was basically a part of the cruiserweight division. A lot of people, they don't realize the cruiserweight division has been looked at as a quote-unquote cast-off division for many, many years. That weight class has basically been looked at as, who the fuck are those guys? But when Usyk finally got in the cruiserweight division, it was looked at the peak level. You had undefeated guys and guys with great amateur backgrounds like Junior Dorticos, the undefeated Cuban sensation, Murat Gassiev, who was trained by Abel Sanchez, Maurice Bradis, Michael Hunter, And then you had other guys there like Marco Huck, David Hay, I believe, and Tony Bellew. So that division was stacked at the time that Usyk was there, and he completely ran through those guys.
Me, Oleksandr Usyk is hands down the greatest cruiserweight champion of all time based on his
Agreed. Really not that comparable.
record, not just based on who I think he could beat in a fantasy matchup. So I've got Usyk over Holyfield resume at cruiserweight, and I've got him over Holyfield in a fantasy matchup at cruiserweight or heavyweight. But in terms of comparing Usyk and Holyfield's heavyweight resumes, let's have a look. So Holyfield beat Buster Douglas. Douglas was somewhat talented, but really a one-hit wonder.
Agreed. And there are certain fighters like that in every generation. They just can't get the discipline down, or they may be talented, or the fighter may not be that particularly talented, but they just win the belt because they had that one perfect night over that great fighter. Ricardo Mayorga over Vernon Forrest. Like, I was having a conversation the other day, I believe in a Facebook poll, and people were talking about Ricardo Mayorga, and he said that Ricardo Mayorga at one point in time was, one of the best fighters and all sort of stuff, and the best welterweight. And maybe at one time he was the best welterweight after he defeated Vernon Forrest. But Mayorga had those two great performances over Vernon Forrest, and he was never to be heard of again. He never won any of his big fights after that. Never. He basically was a guy that was a one-hit wonder or a two-hit wonder. And when you also talk about other guys like Jeff Horn and certain guys like that, Buster Douglas, same exact thing.
Ancient George Foreman.
And that's why I state not every champion within the history of boxing is an elite level fighter.
I think Usyk would have had too many issues with him. Beat Burt Cooper barely. Nearly got taken out in that fight, Holyfield.
Yep, that's a fight overall that I bring up a lot. So when people overall try to debate this stuff about the fighters from the 90s would have been way better today, all sort of stuff, bro, I've already stated this. If guys like Burt Cooper, who is a journeyman heavyweight, can damn near knock Evander Holyfield's head off and overall damn near knock him out, and other guys like Michael Moore, can defeat Evander Holyfield, although he was a solid fighter, but I don't know if I would ever consider him an all-time great. If other guys like that can do that, certain guys like Tyson Fury, AJ Anthony, Joshua, Deontay Wilder, the Klitschko brothers, and also that of Usyk definitely would have at least stood a chance. So this narrative that this era of heavyweights, that they just would have never stood a chance, all that is horseshit.
Beat an old Larry Holmes, lost to Riddick Bowe, beat Riddick Bowe in the rematch, which was a good win. Lost to Michael Moorer, a southpaw. He'd go on to lose to another southpaw in Chris Bird later on in his career, which is one of the reasons that I reckon Oleksandr Usyk would have beaten him. Usyk is better than...
I agree as well. And I mean, if you just compare their skill sets, and their generations weren't that far apart, Holyfield, although exceptionally talented, and I think actually in terms of talent, he's a bit underrated at times, but it's not like he was completely unstoppable. He was someone that would get hit a little bit too much at certain times. He would just get hit a little bit too much. He was also someone that, overall could have a little bit of a problem, on the inside, and it's not like he was able to do what Usyk was able to do, so I mean, it is what it is. And when I say do what he was able to do, I mean overall beat, the best heavyweight of his era, overall that also was a decent amount bigger than him. Evander Holyfield was never able to beat the Lennox Lewis of his day. Now, he did beat Riddick Bowe, but to be fair, I don't know if Riddick Bowe really took Evander all that seriously in the rematch. I think he gained a little bit of weight and thought that Evander would be a little bit too small. People don't know, but Evander, when he was first, kind of up at that weight class, people didn't really think he was going to have much of a chance because he was a cruiserweight fighter. But of course, because of his talent and his skills and all that other stuff, and of course his great athleticism, some of course would allege maybe being on the juice, but I mean, that's up to you. Point being is that, Evander Holyfield turned out to be much better than what a lot of people thought he was, and of course, the first fight, Riddick Bowe ended up winning by decision, I believe, then of course, in the rematch, he ended up defeating Bowe, but then in the third fight, Riddick Bowe ended up knocking him out.
Or Chris Bird, in my opinion.
But
anyway,
that being stated, those are, three great fights.
Holyfield beat Ray Mercer. That was a good performance. Lost to Riddick Bowe in a trilogy match. Beat Bobby Ches, a former light heavyweight champion. Beat Mike Tyson twice. Those were fantastic wins, obviously, against the odds. Tyson being a former undisputed.
Yes, and of course what he means against the odds is because Mike Tyson was expected to eat Evander Holyfield alive in those fights. Not only because they both were looked at early on in their career, and Mike Tyson was always looked at as the best talent of that era, at least before he started losing some of his bigger fights. But on top of that, Evander Holyfield was looked to have so much wear and tear on him because after those three Riddick Bowe fights,
world champion, beat Michael Moorer.
After those three Riddick Bowe fights, because of course in the first fight there still was a lot of wear and tear. They all three were very brutal fights. And he had three of them. And in the third fight, I believe that was the first time he ever got stopped in his career. So Mike Tyson was actually supposed to really just run through Evander Holyfield. But of course, in regular Mike Tyson-like fashion, anytime he fought, overall someone that was a clear all-time great level talent or someone that actually fought back against him, he usually lost.
In the rematch, again, that's a champion on Holyfield's resume in the win column there. Had that draw of Lennox Lewis, controversial draw first time, lost the second.
One of the worst decisions of all time. One of the worst scorecards of all time, that Lennox Lewis versus Evander Holyfield fight. One of the worst ones.
Fight, beat John Ruiz, who would be a future world champion. Fought him 3 times, actually. That was kind of a forgotten trilogy. In the last fight, which was a draw, Holyfield was dropped very heavily by John Ruiz's right hand.
John Ruiz was one of the weaker heavyweight champions of all time. And that's why, although people, of course, when they say that Roy Jones Jr., like I remember when Canelo Alvarez, he was going to go up to fight Ilunga Makabu. And certain people, of course, stated that, well, you can't compare it to Roy Jones versus John Ruiz. It's like, yes, you can. Because John Ruiz was clearly the weakest heavyweight champion there. It's not like Roy Jones went up to heavyweight and said he was going to fight Lennox Lewis. So when people stated that they wanted Canelo to move up to cruiserweight and fight Usyk, like, you want Canelo Alvarez to move to his first fight up at cruiserweight, and you want him to fight someone that's 6'3" when Canelo's 5'7", someone that has a 78-inch reach, someone that's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage over him, and someone that's going to be like, what, 220 pounds? Like, like, are you stupid? Like, I mean, it is what it is. But that just shows you that so many of those channels, they just really wanted Canelo Alvarez to lose. So, I mean, it is what it is. Anyway.
Hasim Ratman, which was kind of a controversial fight. That was a heavyweight title eliminator. Ratman, of course, was a world champion when he...
Now, of course, certain people can debate that John Ruiz maybe was above Makabu's level, but I mean, it would have been a comparable fight.
Knocked out Lennox Lewis. Chris Bird, Holyfield lost to him for the vacant IBF. James Toney, of course, world champion in lower weight classes. Will go on to hold a version of the heavyweight title, but James Toney failed a PED test. Sultan Ibragimov was...
And just to talk about Hasim Rahman very quickly, Hasim Rahman was another fighter that I'm not going to claim that he was a one-hit wonder. I think that he had a couple of great wins or, good wins in his career. But other than the Lennox Lewis win in his career, which was a major, major upset, at the time, other than that, he really didn't do much in his career. So once again, this narrative of, Lewis or some of these guys fighting all these all-time greats, when you talk about all-time great level, there's only usually about, per weight class, only usually about maybe 2 or 3 per weight class, if you're lucky, that are truly all-time great level fighters. When you talk about the 60s, fighters that were actually all-time great level fighters, you're talking about Ali, you're talking about Joe Frazier, George Foreman a little bit later on, maybe Ken Norton, and that's really about it. I mean, of course, some would include Sonny Liston, but I'm not really quite sure if I would include him as a quote-unquote all-time great. He only defended the titles once, and then lost to Ali. But, I mean, that's kind of up to the eye of the beholder.
Heavyweight champion Nikolai Valuev. Most people think that Holyfield should have got the decision.
And, of course, when we talk about the 80s during the Mike Tyson era, there was there was really, in the heavyweight division, really only one all-time great fighter there that really still remained, and that was Mike Tyson. That was really about it. Then when you talk about the 90s, of course, you had debatably Mike Tyson, but in my view, I don't really think Mike Tyson is an all-time great. I know that a lot of people are not going to agree with that, but it is what it is. You had Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson. But, of course, it's a little bit harder to judge because you also had some fighters that maybe didn't have the most extensive resume, but they were supremely talented. Like a Riddick Bowe. Like, I wouldn't consider Riddick Bowe, in my view, an all-time great level fighter, but he was someone that had all-time great level ability.
Against Valuev, but you went against him. Francois Bolter, a former world champion.
Let me also talk about Nikolai Valuev very quickly. And once again, not to interrupt too much here, but this needs to be stated. Because I remember when I reviewed a video by Dante's Boxing Nation, and he was trying to claim how Usyk beat Tyson Fury, that, well, Evander at 40 years old, beat the very big Nikolai Valuev. And someone, I believe, commented this, in my comment section. Valuev was not a talented fighter. He was someone that pretty much would completely use his size. He was a big lug. He was someone that was a champion, but he was not someone that was ever on the talent level of someone like an AJ Anthony Joshua or a Tyson Fury. Not even close. Because those guys actually knew how to use their size, and then they actually had some relative talent. So to even compare that fight, it's something that's completely out of context and something that's not even comparable.
Point. Holyfield fought and beat.
Like, that's basically like me comparing Joe Louis versus Primo Carnera to Rocky Marciano versus, like, Jersey Joe Walcott. Like, it's not even close.
Plenty of past, present, and future world champions and had some great wins, particularly the 2 wins over Mike Tyson and Riddick Bowe. And he had enough longevity for me to still say that his resume at heavyweight was better than Usyk's resume at heavyweight. And then we move on to Lennox Lewis. Lewis fought a load of champions and ex-champions and future champions as well. So the first one, I think, was Mike Weaver. Mike Weaver was a former world heavyweight champion. Lewis beat him. He beat Glenn McCrory, who was a former cruiserweight champion. He beat Tony Tucker, who was a former heavyweight champion. Beat Frank Bruno, who would go on to become heavyweight champion. Lost to Oliver McCall. Beat Tommy Morrison, who will go on. Actually, no, Morrison had been WBO heavyweight champion. Beat Ray Mercer, who'd been WBO heavyweight champion. Beat McCall in the rematch for the WBC heavyweight title. So that's another champion slain. Beat Henry Akin one day, who at one point was WBO heavyweight champion in his career. Beat Andrew Galotta. Beat Shannon Briggs, who was quote-unquote lineal heavyweight champion as well as WBO heavyweight champion. Zelko Mavrovich was a very...
Shannon Briggs was someone that was very physically talented, and he had a little bit of talent. But in terms of, being someone that was a great fighter, I don't know if I would ever consider him a great fighter. He was someone that I believe actually got a robbery decision over that of a George Foreman. But I think that they gave it to Shannon Briggs because, of course, he was the up-and-coming undefeated young fighter. And I think they were kind of starting to look at George Foreman like, how much value is this guy really going to have? He's 40-something years old.
Useful Croatian fighter beat Holyfield.
And George Foreman during that era, during the 90s, is another example of someone overall that was still great during his 40s. He was an A-grade level fighter. Now, was he at his absolute peak anymore? No. But he was still someone that, was still very, very, very dangerous.
In the rematch, of course, the first fight was a controversial draw. But Lewis became unified heavyweight champion in a rematch with a victory over Evander Holyfield on points. That's another. World heavyweight champion slain. Beat Francois Botha, again a former world heavyweight champion. Beat David Tua, who was a dangerous contender. Lost to Hasim Ratman, but got it back in a rematch. Again, that's another world champion. In the win column for Lennox Lewis, beat Mike Tyson, a former world heavyweight champion, and beat Vitaly Klitschko in his final fight, who would go on to become world heavyweight champion. In fact, Vitaly Klitschko had already held the WBO belt, which was lightly regarded back then, but he would go on to be WBC heavyweight champion. So Lennox Lewis's total of 17 world title fights. Oleksandr Usyk's only had 6 so far. You get what I'm saying? So we can't really rate, if we're being objective, Usyk as the best heavyweight of all time based on his resume. But if you want to...
Well, we can't rank him as the greatest heavyweight of all time. But in terms of the best, there's a difference between greatest and best. Do I think that Usyk is in the debate as the best heavyweight of all time? Yes, personally, I do. As the greatest, not quite, because he just doesn't have the tenure nor the amount of fights there. But the thing is that in terms of the best, yes, he can compare with anybody in my view. The fight that I would have loved to have seen the most is probably Usyk versus Lennox Lewis, because their styles would have been probably the most, best in terms of the eras not being separated by that much. And that would have been an amazing, amazing fight. Now, of course, if you're talking about other fighters, if I were to take them from that generation and somehow improve them, and kind of combine them with this generation, also fights that I still would have found very interesting, Rocky Marciano. And, once again, a certain amount of people, they might be like, what's your deal with Rocky Marciano? Rocky Marciano, once again, a lot of people don't understand how much of a monster that dude was. This guy would run, 10, 15 miles a day. Overall, he would basically, from what I hear, swim, over on the lake for cardio. This guy overall was an absolute machine. Hit a 300-pound heavy bag for hours upon hours, spar, overall 30 rounds, in a day from what I remember. This guy overall was an absolute machine, and that's why he was undefeated, because he never got tired. He was someone that debatably probably had the best gas tank out of any other professional boxer within history. And then on top of that, his level of power, especially for his size, absolutely phenomenal. He's beating guys that at times are, 20 pounds bigger than him, or guys that are 15, 20 pounds bigger than him that have a severe reach advantage over him. So Rocky Marciano would have been a very interesting fight, because he actually started to get a little bit technical in the latter part of his career, and he was someone overall that was just always supremely dangerous, But anyway, that being stated, overall, of course, you have that. I would have loved to have seen Muhammad Ali, had you been able to, of course, to put him here, maybe a George Foreman. Joe Frazier, Mike Tyson, of course, would have been interesting. Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis, But Mike Tyson, I don't really put him on the same level as any of those guys. And I know that a lot of people are going to disagree, but it is what it is. Mike Tyson, once again, he had a whole bunch of title defenses, but it just wasn't a very talented era. And Vladimir Klitschko, he would have been interesting as well, but I also consider his era a little bit weak. And I know that a lot of people are going to disagree, but if you take a look at that era, like the final portion of his career or the second half of his title defenses, Like, who the fuck did he ever beat? There's no offense, but it's like, other than Samuel Peter and Alexander Povetkin and a couple of others, like, he was beating guys like Tony Thompson and, you know, all this other shit. Like, no offense, but that was not the most talented era. And that's why when Tyson Fury finally defeated Klitschko, so many people were finally happy, because not only did they not like Klitschko's style, but on top of that, the era really started to show a lot of talent. That was when not only Tyson Fury showed up, but then a couple years later, AJ Anthony Joshua would show up, Deontay Wilder, certain guys like Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, Luis Ortiz, certain guys like that. So when you have guys out here like Aki TV or Dante claiming that this is a dead heavyweight era, no, it's only a dead heavyweight era because their favorite black fighter in Deontay Wilder didn't end up being the best of their era like they wanted him to be. Once again, they kept ranking him highly, and then all of a sudden when he lost, all of a sudden it's a weak heavyweight era. No.
Make the argument that he could beat whoever from boxing history based on a style matchup, in your opinion, I think it's very reasonable. I mean, Duke McKenzie, prior to the Dubois rematch, was downplaying Usyk's chances against the likes of Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson. But after the fight, he said he's changed his mind. He said now he would rate Usyk up there with those guys. Such was the dominance of Usyk in there against Daniel.
I'm not going to claim that Oleksandr Usyk, in terms of an all-around record, you know, or the title defenses, that he has quite the heavyweight resume as those guys. But that being stated, he could have competed with any heavyweight that I've ever seen.
Dubois, and the way he wiped him out in the end, because Drew McKenzie was picking Usyk to win the fight by stoppage late. So Usyk exceeded his expectations. Now here's the thing. In order for Usyk to be in the conversation for greatest heavyweight of all time as far as resume goes, for me, he'd need at least 6 more top heavyweights in the win column on his resume.
I'd probably agree with that, you know, but I don't know if that's going to happen because, first of all, the man's already 38 years old. And on top of that, he doesn't appear to want that many more fights left. And I get it. Like, how, what really more else do you really need to prove? But I mean, the thing is that I would love to see the fight against Joseph Parker. I think that that's obviously the fight that needs to happen next. Then after that, maybe an Andrew Ruiz. I think that would be a great name because Ruiz is still at a decent point in his career. Although I thought that he lost that last fight against Jarrell Big Baby Miller. But that could, of course, just be a bad matchup for him. And then on top of that, Andrew Ruiz is someone that was a former champion. He's someone that not only has a win over AJ, but he also has a win over an older version of Luis Ortiz. But, you know, to be honest with you, I don't know if Andrew Ruiz would have ever lost to Luis Ortiz in the first place. You know, Luis Ortiz is someone that is very talented, but he was always someone that really was super pushed by that of the Deontay Wilder fan base. Luis Ortiz doesn't have any other big wins in his career other than that of Brian Jennings, to be honest with you.
Small. That'll bring him up to a total of 12 world heavyweight title fights, which still isn't the same as Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis. It's not that type of longevity. But if the opponents are of sufficient quality, it might make up for slightly fewer fights. In the
Agreed.
case of Lennox Lewis, again, 17 world title fights. Mike Tyson, 16 world title fights. I think Holyfield similar. Those guys fought a lot of quality opponents, but there was some...
I know, once again, this is going to rub the people, you know, a lot of people the wrong way. Oleksandr Usyk is above Mike Tyson in terms of heavyweight. I know a lot of people are not going to like that. But like I said, name me overall a couple of fighters that Mike Tyson ever defeated that were on the same level as AJ or Tyson Fury. You can't.
Filler there as well. With Oleksandr Usyk, there's been no filler so far. Yes, he's had...
Agreed. Which is why when people overall compare it and basically say that, oh, how can you compare, you know, because Ali has, you know, 50-something fights and all these other fights. Right, but dude, they were a part of a different era. Like, they were a part of an era to where you could fight fighters even sometimes during the reign where they could have been like 13-12 or something like that. So, I mean, it was just completely different. Not saying that that always happened, you know, or that Ali or Joe Louis or certain guys like that or Rocky Marciano during their title reign always did that. But the point being is that, you know, certain fighters did. Like, look at Chavez Sr. Take a look at a lot of his fights during that 87-0 run. Those guys were not always elite.
3 rematches in world heavyweight title fights, but no filler. Lennox Lewis, for example, want to talk about some of the filler he had. Michael Grant, although he was touted at the time as the next top American heavyweight, you can retrospectively see that as filler. Phil Jackson was probably filler as well. Other than that, I'd say Lewis's heavyweight world title run was pretty much full of strong opposition in those 17 fights. But yeah, if Usyk were to fight, let's say, Joe Parker, Ajit Kabayel, Filip Hrgović, Moses Itauma, back at it.
I don't really know if I would fight Filip Hrgović. I mean, I really don't see any reason to fight Filip Hrgović. Filip Hrgović, in my view, and I've been stating this for a while, he's one of the more overrated up-and-coming heavyweights. He doesn't really have that great of movement. He doesn't really have that great of a gas tank. He's someone that can be very hittable. And he's already lost to Danny Dubois. To be honest, his next fight against David Adelaide, and I'm going to be doing fight predictions on that card because I believe that's Nick Ball versus Sam Goodman, as well as David Adelaide versus that of Filip Hrgović, and Moses Itama versus that of Dillian White. That's going to be a very interesting card, especially for the Brits. But of course, I've always, loved watching a lot of the British fighters because they have some great boxing history, but anyway.
Jalilov, Lawrence Okolie maybe, or Martin Bakole.
I'm not really quite sure about Lawrence Okolie or Martin Bakole because those guys, Lawrence Okolie has kind of been a guy that was exposed in one of his, previous fights within his past several fights. And now if it was Jai Opetaia, or Jai Opetaia, however you pronounce that one, New Zealander or Australian fighter's name, yeah, that guy. But Lawrence Okolie, I'm not really so sure about that.
Something like that. If he was to fight 6 of those guys.
In my opinion, Usyk would have to fight Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, maybe a Moses Itama, maybe a Fabio Wardley, something like that. And maybe a couple of other fighters that I'm not thinking of.
And beat them all. Then you can start making a more convincing case that his resume stacks up next to Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield. Maybe it's a stretch to say it would stack up to Muhammad Ali and Joe Louis, but it would at least put him in the
No, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that it stacks up to Joe Louis because Joe Louis's resume isn't really as good as what a lot of people try to say that it is. Is no offense. And I'm not claiming, once again, that he doesn't have a relatively good resume, but once again, he lost to that of Ezra Charles. He lost to him, although, of course, there was a 2-year layoff, and, of course, he really should have lost that first Jersey Joe Walcott fight, one of the worst robberies in boxing history, which is why, once again, I put Rocky Marciano over him.
Conversation, resume-wise, for greatest of all time. The problem is Usyk's already 38. I don't think he has time to get 6 wins of the quality I just described.
Agreed.
If he were to fight all those guys consecutively, I would expect him to lose to one of them. I can't.
Agreed. He's 38 years old, and in his most recent fight against that of Danny Dubois, for the first time, I seen a little bit of aging. I'm not going to claim that he's quote-unquote washed or anything like that because people always go to the extremes, but I did see a little bit of slowing down.
Tell you which, but just given his age and the size of the opponents he's going up against, I'd expect him to lose to one of them. And I
agreed.
think in his prime, Usyk beats all of them. If Usyk was 32, I wouldn't have any doubts about him running through all those guys. I'd make him favorite every time, but he's not 32, he's 38. And even though he beat Daniel Dubois and stopped him earlier in the rematch than he did in the first fight, I still saw signs of Usyk slowing down.
As did I, sir. So did I. I thought that Usyk had lost a step in terms of athletic ability, at least in terms of twitch and in terms of quickness.
That fight. To me, Usyk looked old, but because his...
I'm not going to claim that he looked quote-unquote old, but he's looking older. He's looking someone like has a little bit more age. Someone that, in my view, looks quote-unquote older, really is on their last legs, or someone like a Canelo Alvarez. That's someone overall to me that looks old, although they're still, a pretty good champion, or even a great champion. Usyk, in my view, is at a better point than, say, someone like a Canelo, maybe even a Crawford. But, I mean, the thing is that Usyk, you can definitely tell he's starting to age a little bit.
Skills are so sublime. His technique is so immaculate. Even with diminishing athleticism, which is what I think he has now, his technique, his know-how,
I agree,
and so on, is still good enough to vanquish the likes of Dubois, Luke Partridge, a.k.a. Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, so on and so forth. Although, in my opinion, the best version of Usyk that we've seen at heavyweight was in the first Joshua fight. I think he's been slowly declining since then. But anyway,
I think that Usyk overall looked pretty good even after those fights. It's a little bit hard to judge, though, because Tyson Fury not only is an elite-level heavyweight at his best, but he's someone that was just bigger than Usyk in literally every category. I mean, he was never supposed to beat someone like a Tyson Fury. So, I mean, that was pretty phenomenal. But that being stated, let me also address this last point, because I think that the video is about to end here. But, for people overall that claim that AJ, Anthony Joshua, and Fury, that they cannot be remembered as quote-unquote great heavyweights, well, of course they could. Because when you talk about Fury, he ended up defeating Klitschko when I believe he was about 40 years old, but at the end of the day, he still was the unified champ. And didn't show that much signs of slowing down, maybe a little bit, but still was the unified champion and still was looked at on everyone's list as top 5 pound for pound. So Fury ended up defeating him. Of course, he ended up defeating Dillian White, who, of course, defeated a lot of the top contenders. Of course, he ran through Deontay Wilder, who, of course, was not someone that had the greatest of resumes, but someone that at least beat Luis Ortiz and someone that was still to be highly, highly respected and was, overall someone that, still was a bronze medalist in the Olympics, although that doesn't always mean everything, but, it did happen. And on top of that, he was someone that clearly was someone with a 67-inch reach, or excuse me, someone with an 83-inch reach, and he was 6'7". So he was someone that, although he was a little bit lighter in the ass, he also could be described as a super heavyweight just because of his height and reach and his power alone. So, I mean, it is what it is. And AJ Anthony Joshua, I mean, of course, you're talking about AJ. He had several title defenses of his IBF title. He had wins over Joseph Parker, Alexander Povetkin, Dillian White, Charles Martin, Vladimir Klitschko, although Klitschko definitely was older, but he still gave him one hell of a fight, and AJ was able to come through that. So the point is that when we really take a look at it, AJ and Fury, although it may be debatable for some guys, you could debate those guys possibly within the top 20 heavyweights of all time. You could, so it is what it is. But anyways, that being stated, that pretty much is about it for today. I thought that was very particularly interesting. I'll see if Hatman has anything else to say, and then we'll pretty much end it there.
My take on the claim that Oleksandr Usyk is now the greatest heavyweight of all time, just to clarify, in a fantasy matchup scenario, which is, of course, extremely subjective, I would personally pick Usyk over a lot of the greats.
As would I.
Top 5 heavyweights of all time even, but I don't think that's the best way to order an all-time great list. I think we have to more so base it on resume because it's
Agreed.
something more tangible. It's a body of work.
But I think resume is a little bit different to Hatman than what it is to me. To me, title defenses mean less if I don't think that you were a part of the greatest of eras. And I know a lot of people, once again, are not going to agree with that, but it is what it is.
My thoughts, give me yours in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you on the next one. I'm out.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today on that. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But where would I place Usyk within my all-time greats? He at the very least, is within my top 20 to top 30 fighters of all time. You could debate him, although I'm not exactly sure where I would debate him. But if you were to debate him within the top 20 or top 10 of all time, I would understand it. I wouldn't have a problem with it. And in terms of heavyweights, would I put him probably above Ali in terms of his resume or his tenure there? Probably not. Would I put him over Lennox Lewis? Probably not. Would I put him over guys like, Evander Holyfield? Probably not. But I mean, you could maybe debate it. He doesn't have as many A-grade names there or as many champions. But of course, he did beat the 2 best heavyweights of his era. So I mean, it is what it is. You could debate that Holyfield did not do that. So, I mean, it's kind of up to you. But, would I put him over certain guys like a Joe Frazier? I mean, yeah, you could definitely debate that. I think that I'd probably debatably put him over a Joe Frazier. He definitely would be over guys like Sonny Liston or other guys like that. Would it be above a Rocky Marciano or a Joe Louis? I mean, he might be just because those guys, they were part of a different era. Rocky Marciano, of course, didn't have the longest reign, but I think that his reign actually was a little bit underrated. And as I've already stated, in my view, I'd already put him above Joe Louis, just in my personal view. And I definitely would put Usyk above Joe Louis. I know a lot of people, once again, would heavily disagree, but it is what it is. A lot of during Joe Louis's title reign, they weren't against the greatest of fighters. And then once again, when he actually fought the elite black fighters of his day, overall that were looked at as the best, he ended up losing to some of them. So, I mean, it is what it is. And he also lost to Max Smelling. So, I would definitely put Usyk above Joe Louis as an all-time great level fighter. As a heavyweight, it's a little bit more debatable. But, I mean, it is what it is. Would I put him above Mike Tyson? Yes, I would. And I know that a lot of people overall that they're going to be highly, highly critical of that. But like I said, Mike Tyson really didn't defeat anybody during his reign during the 1980s. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. The fighters that Usyk defeated in Danny Dubois and also that of, but especially Fury and AJ, you can debate were a decent amount better than any of the champions that Mike Tyson ever defeated. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. And like I said, maybe you count the Larry Holmes win as an A-grade level win. I personally do not. And I know that a lot of people are going to disagree, but that's kind of up to you. But anyways, that being stated overall, that's pretty much about it. And that's really all I have to say for today. But the heavyweight division, of course, has a lot of tenure. It has a lot of all-time greats, But that pretty much is about it for today. But Usyk definitely is an all-time great level fighter, no doubt about it. Is he top 10? In my personal view, he is. Probably in the bottom 5. But, I mean, if he does have, say, 4 more title defenses, especially against fighters that are notable, such as Joseph Parker, Andrew Ruiz, and some other guys, I mean, he definitely could be up there. He definitely could be top 5 of all time, especially because he's a 2-time undisputed champion in the heavyweight class, and he never really was supposed to be in the first place. So, I mean, it is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. But as in terms of a fighter, would I place him over fighters like that of an Evander Holyfield, a Mike Tyson, and Joe Louis, and some of those other guys? Yes, personally, I would. I would. But, certain people overall may disagree with that. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.